book of Job, part 2. So, if you recall, there's 3 great questions that this book is seeking to answer, right? And it's, is God just? Does God run the universe on a perfect sense of justice? And how is Job's suffering to be explained? Because remember, Job is blameless, not sin-free, but he's, in a sense, a good guy as far as humans can be good, right? He doesn't deserve to suffer. And so, if he shouldn't be punished, is God just that he's being punished? And that's what this book seeks to answer. And as I was thinking about part 2, actually, today, I was thinking about prayers, and I was thinking of it almost from an atheist standpoint of justice. And so think of this. Think of a true believing Christian yesterday, before the election, and they were praying with a sincere and grateful heart that Kamala would win, because they believed that she would do wonderful, helpful, and loving things in their heart. And they were sincere in this. They believed that she would bring about truly wonderful biblical things, because maybe their worldview was skewed, but that's what they thought, right? And they were bringing these petitions to God, okay? And then think of another truly wonderful Christian who's bringing petitions for Trump that he would win. Well, God obviously answered one prayer, but not the other. Is God just? That's the question. Now, from the human standpoint, depending on what your political party affiliation is, you will either say yes or no. But if you are not a believer in God, you will say this problem that I just gave you would actually prove that God cannot exist. How could a God exist and answer one true believer's prayer that is contradictory to another believer's prayer and still be just? That's a contradiction. But yet we have the book of Job that actually answers this for us. And so that's why I kind of decided to put this in a modern context. Is God just? And by answering these prayers, which prayer did he answer, and was he just? And let's rehash last week when Job was speaking to his 3 wise friends. If we remember, I kind of put it in simplistic terms. They used the prosperity gospel way of thinking, right? Good people receive rewards. Bad people are punished. That is God's justice. That's basically what the poetry section went through, if everybody remembers this, that was here, that didn't skip out because they were sick. Just playing. So they started with the assumption that if you're good, you'll be rewarded. If you're evil, you'll be punished. Job obviously maintained that he was innocent, so no suffering. So his suffering is not divine justice. But as the reader, we knew what the characters didn't. The 3 wise friends disagreed. They said that God is just and he runs the world justly. So Job, it must not be righteous if he was to be suffering. So in other words, Kamala must not be, the Christian that prayed for Kamala must not be righteous, right? And the Christian that prayed for Trump must be righteous. That would be the wisdom of the 3 wise friends. So if you sat there when I presented this in the modern tense and thought that the Christian that prayed and got their prayer answered was correct, notice you're thinking like the 3 wise friends. But when we get to the end of the book, we'll see they were kind of tongue-lashed by God. So, again, is God just? And that's what we seek to find out tonight, the answer to these questions. So, we went through the speeches last week, and Job replied, and we got to kind of Job's reply. And in his reply, Job challenged God's justice, and God responded that Job didn't have sufficient knowledge to challenge God's justice. Job was challenging God, and we're up to like chapter 42 now, because I'm done with last week's recap. So, we're past all the friends' responses, and if you need to catch up, it's on YouTube. So now we're in chapter 42 let me catch up to my notes. All right. I'm going to back up here. So we went through the 3 cycles of speeches, the monologues of Job. All right. This is what happens when you split your class in 2. You get lost, right? So, last week we did cover that this was an emotional book. Job was on an emotional roller coaster. He went from thinking God is just, then Job lashed out at God. I remember telling you guys about that. He accused God of being a bully. He blames God of being evil. That's all around chapters 27, 16. So those are in the cycles of speeches. We get to the 3rd cycle. Chapter 22. Then we get to the interlude of poem on wisdom in chapter 28. Then we get to the monologues. That's where we're picking up this week for part 2. So is everybody tracking like a Scud missile? Clear as mud? Right? Clear as mud? Good? All right. So we're still looking to answer, is God just? But Job and his 3 friends have gone through the monologues. Basically, they all kind of start off, just a little recap. Job maintains his innocence. The further they go down, the more his friends accuse Job of not being just. They make up a bunch of crimes. Job lashes out at God. Like I said, he accuses God of being a bully. We kind of conclude with a poem on wisdom. We get some monologues between, and then this guy, Elihu, which I told you is the only Hebrew name last week in our fun facts. He shows up, and this is about chapter 29. And we're going to get Job's closing remarks. Because, again, this is also kind of like a courtroom drama, right? Like if we look at the book of Job. But this is still the poetry excerpt portion. And he's going to, he's going to assert his innocence. And he really doubles down on his demands of an explanation from God. How am I innocent, but I'm being, all this evil's being inflicted on me? Remember, his kids are dead. His wealth is taken from him. Ken missed my really good joke about this for the new people here. When the Satan, and this is also just kind of a catch-up, we actually got to kind of see a fall of an angel in the heavenly scene, because it's not Satan, it is a title, the Satan, the accuser. The accuser is allowed to inflict damage upon Job, and so kills his kids, takes his wealth, does all these bad things, and then does the worst thing ever, leaves his wife alive. So, yes, and then she says, why don't you curse God and die? There is actually a lot of biblical stuff into that about marriage, but we won't go there. So, Job, he demands an explanation from God, and that's in 31:35. He says, "Oh, that I had one to hear me. Here is my signature. Let the Almighty hear me, and the indictment of my adversary is written." So this is just a poetic way of him basically, when he's saying my signature is written, he's attesting almost like in a legal format that, hey, I'm making a sworn declaration before God, like I'm innocent. But notice he's also still calling God his adversary. He's still on this emotional roller coaster. He's still not. He's blaming God for all these problems that have befalled him, the loss of his wealth, the death of his kids, his wife nagging him. All these things, these are God's fault. And he's still referring to, let the Almighty answer me, and the indictment which my adversary has written. So in this poetic form, he still hasn't come to terms with why would God punish him if he's innocent? Where is the justice? Is God running the whole universe on a just scale? Right? And Job's using himself as the example. I know that I've been innocent, and look at what you did to me, God. And so this guy Elihu shows up, the fourth friend, and it's the first of the Hebrew names. And again, back to the introduction when we were talking about like where this takes place and all the names and all this stuff. Very interesting that we have a Semitic name that shows up. And he kind of enters in this idea of predetermination. He gives this idea. He believes that God is just like the three other friends, Bildad and all them, and that the world runs according to justice. And remember, their idea of justice: do good, receive good; do bad, get bad. That's the idea of justice, right? That's divine justice. So he believes this. But he thinks it to the next step. The conclusion is that Job will do something horrible. And so God's correcting him now in the present for what he might do so that he won't do it. It's a form of pre-retributive justice. So God is so all-knowing that, yeah, you've been a really good guy and you've never messed up, but I know that in the future you're going to mess up, so I'm going to punish you now. Think Minority Report if you've seen that movie. It's with Tom Cruise. It's an older movie. It takes place in the future. They basically arrest people before they commit the crime so that they don't commit the crime. Really bizarre idea of predetermined futures, right? And so that's what Elihu is saying is you're going to mess up, so God's going to punish you before you mess up. Ugh. That's justice for you. Can you imagine if you were a kid and just being really good, and your dad walks in and just takes his belt off and spanks the living crap out of you, and you're, what'd I do, Dad? I don't know, you're going to do something. Right? Like, that's the idea that Elihu's bringing in. I don't know, you're going to steal a cookie out of the cookie jar one of these days. Like that's the idea that he brings forward. And he says that makes God just, because in the future you will sin, so God's correcting you now. And then again, Elihu, so it's not suffering for sin in the past, like what Bildad and all the other friends said, like you sinned in the past, so you're being punished for what you did in the past. Elihu takes it to the next step, this predetermined future. Job doesn't even answer him. He was just like, that's foolishness. I'm not even going to answer you. So at this point in chapter 38, God just comes in because Job refuses to answer Elihu. God comes in. And the first thing he does is he takes Job on like the cosmic LSD trip, like the virtual tour of the universe, right? And he just goes all around. He shows up, but he's not really answering any of Job's questions. That's what we find out. Job has said, remember, he says, oh, that I had one to hear me. Here's my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. And so what does God do? He shows up and goes, come with me. Let me show you the universe. Were you there when I laid the foundations? Right? Pretty famous verse. Everybody knows that verse out of Job. Were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Like, can you create something out of nothing? Are you that smart? Like, you think you know how to order this universe? You think you know about divine justice? That the good get... If you do good, you get good. If you do bad, you get bad. All right. Design your own universe from nothing. That's what God is saying right now. There's an old joke. A bunch of scientists are sitting around and they're like, and you guys probably know this because it's a really old joke. In fact, it's so old, I actually remember hearing this when I was a kid being forced to go to church before I became an agnostic. So that's how old this joke is. And I still remember it because I liked it. But a bunch of scientists are all sitting around, and they look up at the heavens because they figured out how to create humans from nothing. They've got everything figured out. They go, you know what, God, we don't need you. We can create humans from nothing. We know how to achieve immortality. We've got this all figured out. You can just go away now, God. We got it. God goes, yep, I see that you do that. now get your own dirt, right? Like, and that's basically what God's telling Job. Like, hey, were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. So that's kind of what God's getting to in this very famous verse is, all right, you think you know about justice? Let's start big with the whole universe. Can you create the universe? Tell me, do you have understanding? And as he goes on this just cosmic virtual tour from the big, what you'll see in the poetry with the God's speech is going to get small. Because eventually he's going to sit there and be like, are you there when a deer gives birth? Do you know how to feed a deer grass? Right? Like, so we just went from creation of the whole universe to, how a deer eats grass. Like, and this is what God's getting at with Job. Like, he can create the whole universe. He can feed grass to a baby deer. That's the order that God designs in the universe. From the biggest, most cosmic thing to the smallest little detail. And God does it all. Tell me, do you have understanding? That's what God has to do. So in Job 39 verses 1 through 4, do you know the time a mountain goat gives birth? Do you observe the calving of deer? Can you count the months they fulfill? Or do you know the time they give birth? God knows every deer and every time they give birth. He also knows how to make a universe from nothing. It's pretty impressive. They kneel down, they deliver their young, and they get rid of their labor pains. Their offspring becomes strong, they grow up in the open field. They leave and they do not return. See, God's just talking about these little small details, and he knows every single one. We'll read elsewhere. God knows the number of hairs on your head. For some, it's pretty difficult. For others, it's pretty easy. Sorry. But he knows all the details, right? He's got to add them all up. So, but now what we as the reader have to do is we have to ask, well, Job said, "Oh Lord, answer me." So why did God answer him like this? Because remember the three questions. Is God just? Does he run the world on perfect justice? And how is Job's suffering to be explained? So when we get down, why did God answer like this? Remember, Job and his friends thought that they knew God's justice. If you do good, you will be rewarded. If you do evil, you will be punished. And remember last week I said that sounds a lot like Joel Osteen. So, seems like they're kind of wrong. There's actually a much deeper truth. As humans, we do not have close to enough perspective to know God's justice. That's kind of God's point here. How much less to make a claim on how God ought to run the world. So back to, the atheists looking at the two very true and devout Christians praying for the election. One for Kamala, one for Trump. Well, there can't be a God. Well, again, if we look at it from our perspective, sure, you can make that case. But Job has just taught us, we're just looking at it from our little perspective, our little blinders on. When you take the blinders off, tell me if you have understanding. Look at it from the whole perspective of creating a universe from nothing and ordering the movement of the stars to knowing when every little bird chirps. Tell me if you have understanding. Once you have to have that kind of understanding, now you have to know what is true justice throughout the whole universe, not just to what is just to one person. Because sure, for the Christian that prayed for Kamala, they feel like they have no justice. For the person that prayed for Trump, they feel like they have justice. But really, God wasn't looking at either one during those prayers. He was looking at the whole universe and all of time and all of everything else. Yes, he hears those prayers, and that's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying he does. And remember, he knows when every little calf is. And Jesus says, God had dressed the flowers in all their splendor better than Solomon. How much more does he love us, right? So If God knows when every deer is born, how much more does he love us? So don't get me wrong. He loves our prayers. Ken, in one of his sermons, even pointed out how much our prayers are going to matter in the book of Revelation when they go to be burned as incense. So don't take that away. I'm pointing to God's justice as it relates to prayers. He hears the prayers, but they are weighed in a sense of justice that's well beyond what we understand. And that's the point. There is no contradiction, as the atheist would put it. God is seeing something far beyond what we can see when he answers the prayer. They are both receiving justice. Equal love and equal from God for both the one that prayed for Kamala and the one that prayed for Trump. They're both receiving equal love. The justice is for the universe, not for the person being prayed. And that's what the book of Job is trying to get at. What might seem like divine injustice from a personal point of view and is just... let me read my notes. What seems like divine injustice from a personal point is just that, a limited person point of view. And we are not in a position to make such a huge accusation of God. And then we have so another movie throwback. I don't know if you guys are Jim Carrey, Bruce Almighty. Have you guys ever seen that movie, Bruce Almighty? Where Morgan Freeman plays God and lets Jim Carrey be God for like a week or something. Okay, so in the book of Job, we're going to have a Bruce Almighty moment, all right? So basically God, after having this conversation with Job, goes, you think you can run the world on justice by your standard? Do it. Might be where they actually got the movie idea from, to be honest. So it's in Job 40, 1 through 4. Then the Lord said to Job, will the fault finder contend with the Almighty? So God's kind of throwing down the gauntlet here to Job. You think you know justice? Will you contend with the Almighty? Let him who rebukes God give an answer. So Job said, will the Almighty answer me? God's like, you answer me. Then Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I'm insignificant. What can I say in response to you? I put my hand on my mouth. Basically, Job's saying, I just learned my lesson. So when God said, will the fault finder contend with the Almighty? He's saying, why don't you go ahead and run the universe for a day? You can use your sense of justice from your personal view. Every time somebody does good, go ahead and reward them. Every time they do bad, go ahead and do some divine injustice. Tell me how that works out for you. Now that you've seen how the stars are ordered down to how the mountain goats graze, go for it. That's why Job went, I'm just going to put my hand out my mouth and I'm going to shut up now, right? Because he realized from his personal point of view that God's justice is so much more than like this prosperity idea that his friends had thought of, that his suffering had nothing to do with justice. It was just something that happened, right? Like he still didn't know that Hasatan, the Satan, was the one that inflicted him. He's ignorant of this fact. He just knows that his suffering has nothing to do with justice. God is still perfectly just. So, then God's going to conclude, and this is where this is probably where my interpretation, or I wouldn't say interpretation, my understanding based on context and biblical spread means the whole Bible, might be a little bit more in line with a supernatural reading of the Bible. So I will say that because God's going to conclude with spiritual warfare on why he provides justice, and he uses the behemoth and the Leviathan. So there's a few interpretations of what the behemoth and the Leviathan are. Some say that it's a crocodile and a hippopotamus. It doesn't really make sense. Like, go ahead and throw that into the poetry and everything we talked about, and then a hippo and or a hippopotamus and a crocodile show up. Okay, explain that to me. Like, it's not going to make any sense in context of what we're talking about with justice and suffering. I think I mentioned last week, again, when the evidence is weighed, I lean towards young earth creation. A lot of young earth creationists use this verse to point to dinosaurs in the Bible. I wish that were true. I don't see the evidence on that one. Even as a young earth creationist myself, I do not see this as a dinosaur verse. However, the Leviathan is a serpent type creature. Serpents, we go back to the Garden of Eden with the serpent, and then we go to Revelation with the dragon. The serpent imagery throughout the entire Bible is typically associated with fallen angels. The behemoth is only mentioned once, so it's very hard to develop context with it, but the little bit we can do, we can give a little bit of supernatural fallen angel context to it. Makes it sound like the way God talks about the behemoth and the Leviathan, especially with the Leviathan being in waters are chaotic. Think Genesis 6, the waters are meant to come and destroy the Nephilim, which are, one interpretation is they are supernatural beings, is that the behemoth and Leviathan are very dangerous, and they can cause suffering. That's spiritual warfare. But with God's justice, there is still a sense of safety in the world. Not that the world is safe, but there is a sense of safety. And so we do live in an amazing world, and that's kind of God's point. He created this world, but it's not safe, and it's not perfect. So why is there suffering in the world? Well, we don't get a direct answer from God. He just kind of leaves that one blank for us. He just lets us know that we do live in an amazing world and that it's not designed to prevent suffering, at least not yet. That's what God leaves us with in Job. That, even with the behemoth and the Leviathan and these fallen angelic creatures that are able to survive, and he's able to keep us safe in this world in all the amazing stuff that we've seen, he lets us know that this is not a perfect world, but we are safe here because God's in control. And like I said, this world was not designed to prevent suffering, but he lets us know, at least not yet. When we get to Revelation, you'll know why I say, at least not yet. So, Job replies to God in 42. Job challenged God's justice, and God responded that he didn't have sufficient knowledge. Job demanded a full explanation. God asked Job for trust. This is kind of the back and forth. I'm summarizing it for you. So, Job Job challenged God's justice. God says, you don't have the knowledge. Job demands a full explanation. God says, trust me. Job responds with repentance and apologies. That's kind of how this back and forth goes at the very end. The ending of Job, right? We're out of the poetry. And so then in the very last of the closing, God then looks at the friends and says that they were wrong, to include Elihu, the one that came up with the crazy forward-thinking predestination idea. Like, God's like, no, I'm not going to pre-punish you either. But then the weird thing is, God approves of Job. And it almost makes you want to scratch your head like, well, wait a minute. Job called God a bully. Job straight up threw down a gauntlet saying, God, answer me if you dare. And it's like, God's approving of this? And no, that's not what the Bible's saying. It's not saying throw a temper tantrum and act like a child with God. What we pull out of this is what God approved of was Job's struggles, right? Like, Job had a real conflict with suffering and justice. And he struggled with that before the Lord, not by himself, right? Even though he was talking with his friends were also godly. And that's something that we should take with it. Were they a little bit off the mark as far as their understanding of God? Sure, we know that because God rebukes them. But with other fellow believers in fellowship, he struggles with this. He wasn't keeping it to himself. And God approves of that. We are made to think. And when we get into the New Testament, and like Isaiah, the Lord tells Isaiah, come, let's reason together. The Shema in Deuteronomy, worship God with all your heart. Mind. I'm talking about the mind, I'm forgetting stuff. But Jesus will quote that, like, we are made to think. And so the fact that he's thinking about this with other believers and struggling over this idea, that's what God approves of. He's using his brain. And it's his honesty. He's not being a hypocrite about this. He's being raw and real. And remember, I said this was an emotional roller coaster when you read the poetry. That's why it's put in this poetic form, is so that we can see the emotion, so that we can see his honesty. And what I didn't cover a lot was his prayers through this. Like, there's a lot of praying when you read Job. And as he's struggling, as he's being honest, he's praying to God. Yeah, he's calling God a bully, but he's doing that as he's praying to him. And it's very strange. And I don't suggest that you call God a bully. So don't come out of here tonight when you go to bed and go, I didn't get my way, you bully. I would not suggest that. Do not tempt the Lord Almighty. All right? Not a recommendation. But he's going to God in honest, struggling prayer. And that's what God approves of. Why? Because this world's not perfect. Not yet. All right? And that's what the book of Job is about. God is just not in a way that we can see yet. What are your questions?